my AP literature friends. Kristian Kuhn coming at you again for another writing workshop, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of Composition. And up my sleeve today, I have FRQ1 from the 2022 exam, Richard Blanco Shaving. So in this writing workshop, I'm going to state a status quo, and I'm going to show you how to manipulate my inverted thesis template in order to house the introductory paragraph. Make sure you're really honed in on a thesis in there. And then we will proceed through a few body paragraphs using my heuristic known as the syllogistic method. And for good measure, I'll show you how to throw a conclusion paragraph onto this essay as well. So please make sure you subscribe, hit the like, and spread the good word far and wide. This is my new YouTube channel. We're quickly approaching 20,000 subscribers, and it's growing fast and doing quite well. So thank you for your support. In terms of the prompt, let's break this down. First, I'm going to tell you that this was one of the trickier passages I've seen in a while on the for an FRQ1, chiefly because students really needed to have a good knack to perform tight syntactical reads. So if that is an area that you're a little weak with, maybe do a little powwow with your teacher and have your teacher unpack this a little bit for you. My exemplars, especially as I get into my body paragraphs, you'll see what I mean by the level of complexity that I'm doing at syntactical level. If that's beyond your grasp, then definitely get some training on that. So here's the prompt. In Richard Blanco's poem Shaving, published in 1998, the speaker writes about the act of shaving. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Blanco uses literary elements and techniques to develop the speaker's complex associations with the ritual of shaving. So it's kind of a common fare prompt. But like I said, in terms of ascertaining the meaning of the poem and getting into like the deep complexities of it, you got to be kind of a syntactical ninja with this one. So immediately we're staring at our blank sheet of paper, our blank screen, and we got to ask ourselves the question, so how do I write the intro? Well, in order for any of this to make sense, I got to Bob Ross my instruction. If you're familiar with Bob Ross, he likewise used heuristics, and he used something called the wet on wet technique every time he approached a natural landscape. And just like Bob Ross, I'm going to get to my easel and canvas in this presentation, and I'm going to paint, I'm air quoting there, paint with and for you so that the process will be completely demystified. You can follow along and just etch your paper along with me. Based on my lead. So teachers, I always encourage for teachers to take a Bob Ross approach. And students, I think this is one way in which you learn best. This is what learning looks like for me. So back to that prompt. I got some breaking top secret news for this. Any prompt that you see for FRQ1 or FRQ2 on the AP Literature exam, implicit in the language of that prompt are two questions, and here they are. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? In terms of how we're going to approach this, my introductory paragraphs are always 4 sentences long, and my students will take 3 sentences to answer what is the author's intent. And teachers have many ways to ask that question. What's the exigence, the universal truth, the universal theme, things along those lines. And then you got to be mindful of this. Whenever you answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? That constitutes or comprises the actual thesis statement. So we're going to go 3 sentences of authorial intent up top. Last sentence is the construction of meaning sentence. So let's break this down visually. So it's known as an inverted thesis because our last sentence is going to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? So in the inverted thesis paradigm, you end with the thesis. So the first 3 sentences are going to be some context background, get to the universal truthiness of the poem, and then there's other things that I want to see students do in this. Sprinkle in a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary throughout the entirety of your essay. You have to cop a certain academic tone. It is an academic paper. You're writing for an academic audience. So by tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. And then sentence constructs. So a lot of folks know that I run intensive word study academies with my students. Their vocabularies grow pretty exponentially over the course of the academic year if they give me an iota of effort. And then in order to really maintain a certain quality within the voice, the rhythm, the flow, right, in terms of positioning yourself for the sophistication point, students need to be able to wield sentence constructs that are more complex than short, simple declaratives and independent clauses. So my students go through my Nuance Academy, in which we study Strunk and White's Write It Right. In particular, their rule number 18, in which they make the assertion that there's 12 ways to write a single sentence. On top of that, there's 20 patterns for those types. So you'll see in my exemplars that I'll model this for you. I'll show you what complexity looks like at sentence level and set you up so that you can become your own syntactical ninja. But also note that within my YouTube channel, I have several exercises on the 20 sentence patterns and the 12 sentence types. So let's review this. It's 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Let's look at exemplar number 1, and I'll show you what I mean by this. So the first 3 sentences are going to be universal truthiness. Last sentence, I'm going to hit you with my terms, devices, techniques. And in that last sentence, I can't just drop some willy-nilly arbitrary terms, devices, techniques. I need to hit you with the most salient ones, the most germane, relevant ones. And typically, I only focus on 2. If it's a real juicy piece, I'll focus on 3. But in this one, I focus on the 2 most important ones. So here's a read of this. Death is not the opposite of life, but is instead an integral and interconnected part of it. In fact, every aspect of life and living is conjoined in the sense that nothing really separates man from nature. Mere deeds like shaving and writing are woven into the great scheme of how every aspect of existence serves to remind the individual that everything is tied together. We are at the 4th sentence. Look at the terms, devices, techniques to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? Blanco hits upon this concept through his extended metaphors and syntactical arrangements. So right there, manifestly, you can see an expression of the terms, the devices, the techniques. So the first 3 sentences, I'm getting to exigence, universal truth, universal theme. What's the big aha moment? Why did Blanco write this? What's he trying to convey? What's his gist? So take 3 sentences to do that. You'll notice my vocab is up in this. Good words, and I don't overdo it, right? Integral, interconnected, conjoined. Words like that are what constitute tier 2. And the idea is, using $1 million words is not the equivalent of good writing, but you have to really teeter-totter that academic voice. Note the sentence constructs. Each one is different from the one that precedes it, right? And that's one of the things I tell my students. Don't parallel your syntax, especially in the introduction. Try to come out of the gate with the best flow, the best rhythm that you possibly can achieve. And as you can see, it's exactly 4 sentences. Students might be scratching their heads saying, ooh, that's really unclear, Kristian. So let's do it again. I'll show you number 2. When I teach, I usually show my students 3 times how to do things, and that typically demystifies it for them. Very simple opening sentence. Everything is one. And I think that's kind of the universal theme of Blanco's poem. I expressed it in 3 words. Life and death are one, the river and the sea are one, and so is the act of shaving and writing. When one can see how everything in life is contingent upon the other, the mundane becomes miraculous. Blanco highlights this through his frequent employment of similes and syntactical arrangements. And some of you astute observers will say, but Kristian, this is only 3 sentences. And here's what I tell my students. we're using a heuristic. We're not using a despotic, tyrannical law. So you can see in that second sentence that I have two semicolons. So I'm saying I said everything that I needed to say in three sentences. And because of the two semicolons, I am ostensibly writing four sentences, but students can take liberties like that. It's not fast and hard laws. I said everything that I need to say. I really unpacked it, and it's all there. And I'm doing the exact same stuff that I was doing in the first one. My vocab is up. Nice words like mundane is really good. Contingent, employment. So the words the vocabs is really good. Sentence constructs are all varied, and it has good voice rhythm and flow. Last sentence, I hit you with simile and syntactical arrangements. I think those are two of the key instrumental terms, devices, techniques that kind of glue the whole piece together and sort of are the backbone of the whole piece. Students, yes, you can do this. It's easy if you practice it and are consistent with the heuristic. So let me unpack it one more time. For the individual who sees how everything in life is connected, death is but the next natural segue in the grand mundane adventure. Man is forever linked to the natural world. He comes from it and spends his earthly days in it and will return to it upon passing. When one can see how all the individual pieces of life link together inextricably, it can afford a lot of peace. Three sentences of universal truthiness. Last sentence. Hit me with the terms, devices, techniques. In this one, I dropped three. So just to give you an example of how to do that. Blanco arrives at such an epiphany through his naturalistic imagery, extended metaphor, and syntactical maneuvers. Again, vocab up, sentence structures are a swinging and a flowing. I even used a dash in there. So my students know how to use all those things. So you saw me do it a couple of times, semicolons, colons, dashes, ellipses, commas. My students are masters at that if they focus in class and give me an iota of effort. So let's pause here. As students, give it a whirl. Try the 3+1 inverted thesis heuristic. Show your work to each other, do some peer editing, have your teacher look over your shoulder, and give it a whack and see what happens. Just try it out. Next question, because we have a ton of blank canvas. Our intro's done. So we got to ask ourselves the question, so how do I write the body paragraphs? And as I've already alluded to, we are going to proceed with the syllogistic method heuristic. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition, comes from Aristotle. He had a school called the Lyceum, and the town's boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would often throw out these juicy, essential questions. And one such question is, what is justice? Which is the core question of a seminal text called Plato's Republic. And the scholars, the philosophers, the think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition. And Aristotle noted that some students were excellent at this, some were men, some kind of were all over the place and got wayward and discursive in their arguments. And he said, why is that? So he opened up the lid of the really good thinkers, the really good orators, and he had a eureka moment. And he said, I got it. The really good orators, the kids that argue the best, have a calculative approach. They have like a methodological approach that's almost mathematical and computative. And he coined it the syllogistic method. And it's like a math formula in which you argue from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say to you, premise one, arsenic is deadly, you would say, yup, Kristian, I agree with you. But then if I follow it up with premise two and say, my dog ate arsenic, you're naturally going to conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's probably going to die, right? Aristotle would call that cogency. In composition, we call it line of reasoning. And one of the principal things that we're concerned with as composition teachers is your logic, how you think on paper, which is the line of reasoning. So how do we morph this heuristic, Aristotle's heuristic, into a heuristic to perform literary analysis? I got you covered. First premise is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. I like my students to take 3 sentences to do this because on FRQ1 of the AP Lang exam, the College Board states a couple of times, your argument must be central. And one of the things that we have to remember is that we're performing literary analysis, which is an expository mode. Therefore, we are arguing. And if we start quoting and paraphrasing way up in our body paragraph, we're not going to perform literary analysis. We're going to break the demand of the assignment. And by default, we're going to do a faux pas. And I call it plot synopsis, plot analysis. We write like cliff note summations of the poem. We can't do that. We have to argue. And when we argue, we have to use the terms, the devices, and the techniques. So I'll model that 3-sentence move in just a second. Second premise begins in the 4th sentence. I like to see students take a teeter-totter approach to the quoting and the paraphrasing. Don't do one far more at the expense of the other. And then we have to be mindful that body paragraphs need to be concluded. We just can't end on a quote and run like heck and ditch our argument. We have to go full circle, link it back to the prompt, echo the thesis, and make sure that we're keeping the promise of the first premise. And I will model all of that for you right now. So the question becomes, what's a first premise look like? It looks like this. Students often ask me, Mr. Kuhn, how do I begin my body paragraph? Where do I begin my body paragraph? And my tacit answer is this. Start where Blanco starts and indicate to your reader that you have a chronology, that you're going to be very methodical in your execution of your analysis. So I'm not a big fan of sentence stems. That's why I steer away from templates. I think you guys are smart and can generate your own language. You definitely don't need me to do the writing for you. But if you want a stem, I have a clause for you. It's 4 words and a comma right from the onset. It cues your reader into knowing that you have a nice calculative approach through your analysis. So right from the onset, comma, and then you talk about the first moves that Blanco makes. Blanco manipulates his syntax to highlight his theme. So you can see here, I'm explicitly using the terms, the devices, the techniques. In stacking similes, he also reinforces the idea that life's big mystery is quite simple to understand. Everything is connected to the laws of nature and the natural order of things. I'm going to focus on the thematic aspects, of course. Even his reflections upon his father's life while shaving belong to this sense of connection. So you can see there that took 3 sentences, but here's the kicker. You see that I'm multitasking in terms of connecting terms, devices, techniques together to get to the construction of meaning. This is what we refer to as complexity. It's very uncomplex to do 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph extended metaphor. That's very dutiful and plodding. It's not going to bode well for your score, and it's very elementary in its approach. So what I do here, when I'm done with my first premise, is I go textual support hunting, right? I need quotes and paraphrases for what I dropped in that first premise. And I often refer to this as the promise of the first premise. So what did I promise you? I promised you an analysis of syntax, an analysis of theme, and then the juxtaposition between the father's life, shaving, and writing. So I need quotes and or paraphrases like that. And that's what I mean by keep the promise of the first premise, right? If I provide you with textual support and textual analysis for all 3 of the terms that I dropped, I will be cogent, I will have a line of reasoning, and therefore will have kept the promise of the first premise. So let's jump all the way to the 4th sentence, and I'll show you how I put this all together. So again, I need quotes, paraphrases for all 3 of the terms, devices, techniques that I laid down in that first premise. I said syntax first, so how about I keep everything in order and start with syntax? Check this out. Immediately, Blanco conjoins the first two clauses with a comma splice. Hey, check that out. I'm focused on syntax. He informs us that he is not shaving, he's writing about it. The comma splice is an interesting feature because it cues the reader to the idea that Blanco is likewise going to connect everything to highlight the gist of his theme. The hyphen gives way to a long series of similes that show how even something as mundane as shaving and writing are like ocean steam rising from clouds, and ultimately the same silent forces that quietly orchestrated his father's life and passing. So I got syntax and I got similes, and I have quotes and or paraphrases for the two of them. Let's keep going, right? Let's add to this because this is a major part of the poem. Blanco with a contemplative and musing tone. So even though I didn't mention tone in the first premise, I can check that off my list and say, all right, I mentioned the tone. Is beginning to see that the discrete mystery of how whiskers grow is really the same thread to explain the drink roses take from the vase. And you can see here by my quote paraphrasing, weaving together, I'm getting to the theme as well. The universal truth, the universal theme. Things in life just happen like the bloom of spider webs each morning, but all too often one does not pause long enough to take a notice of how everything in life is like one gigantic jigsaw piece. And you can see in my parentheses there, I say link it all together. We got to conclude the thought. We're not done. We got to go full circle back to the prompt and back to the thesis, keep the promise of the first premise. Here's my conclusion. And again, conclusions usually just take 2 or 3 sentences. In acknowledging his own mortality, Blanco is beginning to see that their simple acts like shaving and writing likewise mark the days of his father's life. There's an intensity to vanishing, but knowing that life is fleeting and impermanent is comforting given that everything belongs to a divine order. And you can see there that this took me 10 to 12 sentences. And that's usually what I tell my students to shoot for in terms of the length of a body paragraph, 10 to 12 sentences. So if you're writing with me, pause here and give a whirl at that first premise, right? 3 sentences right from the onset comma, drop your terms, devices, techniques, focus on the tippy top of the poem. And then fourth sentence, the second premise begins at the fourth sentence. Go quote hunting and find all the quotes and paraphrases for the terms, the devices, techniques that you drop in that first premise. Weave it all together and make sure you tag a conclusion on that. Shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. So first paragraph is done in terms of the introduction. First body paragraph is done. What do we do next? The answer might surprise you. You're going to bust out another syllogism. Ask yourself what's left. So we're at about the middle of the poem, and there's still a whole bunch of other stuff in terms of terms, devices, techniques that we have to analyze. This is going to be a 4-paragraph essay for all 6 FRQs, and I'm talking the Lang exam and the lit exam combined. My students always write 4 paragraphs. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So again, give this a whirl. You're going to do the exact same thing. Follow the pattern. Follow the heuristic. 3 sentences first premise. Switch up the terms, the devices, techniques. Go quote hunting from the middle all the way to the bottom of the poem. Make sure you tag a conclusion on it, 10 to 12 sentences. But we ain't done at that stage of the game either. We got to wrap the essay up with a conclusion paragraph. And my friends, my students, I use some stems early in the beginning of the year, just as a training wheel, just as a scaffold to help my students out. So we use stems that are kind of like the grand finale of a fireworks display, where we're screaming back to the reader, exigence, universal theme, universal truth, big idea, the gist, right? The pith and the substance of the whole poem. So we use encapsulating stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, in a global sense. And we take 3 or 4 sentences to wrap everything up. So that's pretty easy. I'm going to let you guys tackle that on your own without me belaboring things. I have confidence that you can do that without my going over it thoroughly. So give that a whirl. All right, I'm signing off. Happy teaching, happy writing. Good luck with this one. And if for any reason you need to reach out to me, drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I love to hear from teachers and students, so don't be trigger shy. I always respond to emails, and it kind of excites me when I get them. Note that I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. I present for NCTE quite often, Perfection Learning, and the College Board. So to stay abreast of my calendar of events and my PD offerings, I have a website, teachinghowtowrite.com. You can see what's on the docket in the coming days and months. Students, I have a tutoring company called Write at Ivy Write. So I got my graduate degrees from Ivy League institutions, and I'm expert on teaching students the college personal statement as well as preparing them for their AP exams, both Ling and Lit. So I've been teaching those for 20 plus years. So if you want to work with me, you can hire me as your tutor. Just drop me an email and we can get into the specifics of that and see if I'm a good fit for your needs and wants. All right, I'm signing out. This is the end. I'll see you at the next writing workshop.